Okay, good morning. And today is Martin Luther King's birthday, and it's Martin Luther King Day. Martin Luther King would have been 95 years old today. Hard to imagine. This talk is really about Martin Luther King during his time, 1968. And it was a commission job that I got from the Larchmont Library 6 years ago. They were doing a retrospective on 1968, and they said, you got a radio and TV background, so tell us how 1968 came into your living room. And I will tell you how 1968 came into your living room. That's Barbara Walters. And she was on the Today Show, and here she is. She is selling a TV. As part of her duties on the Today Show, she did a commercial. And I still have the stand at home. It just sits there with a lot of stuff on it. But anyway, she was doing kind of a news show in the morning, Today Show, news and features. And but TV was a big deal. In fact, I'm going to ask you, how many of you watched Batman? Anybody? Batman. Okay, well, if you didn't, I could still ask this question. Who is the better Catwoman, Julie Newmar or Eartha Kitt? Well, there's a reason to my madness here, because the year starts out poorly for Eartha Kitt. It's January 18th, and she's invited to the White House, and she is going to be honored as one of the significant women in the United States in 1968. And so she goes to this thing. She doesn't want to be there, but she goes. And she's going to meet Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States, and Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady. And so she decides she is going to discuss life with Lady Bird Johnson and the President, Lyndon Johnson. She says, Mr. President, what are you going to do about delinquent parents, those who have to work and are too busy to look after their children? Well, Lyndon Johnson answers her, but there is Eartha Kitt, there is Lady Bird Johnson, and this is kind of the end of Eartha Kitt's career in the United States for a long time, because she got Lady Bird Johnson upset and got Lyndon upset. Johnson says, Lyndon Johnson said, we've just passed a Social Security bill that gives millions of dollars to daycare centers. She wasn't satisfied. But what are we going to do? LBJ said that's something for the women to discuss here. He left, but Kitt wanted to know why there were American boys in Vietnam. Anybody protest the war, by the way, in here? Where'd you protest?
Which?
Where did you protest?
I was in college.
Which college?
Hunter College.
Hunter?
In the Bronx.
Hunter, well, we're going to talk about the protests in a minute. Anyway, she said to Johnson, you send the best of this country off to be shot and maimed. They rebel in the streets. They will take pot. They will get high. They do not want to go to school because they're going to be snatched off from their mothers to be shot in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson called some of his high-powered friends in the entertainment industry, and that was the end of Eartha Kitt's career for quite a while. She went into exile. Lyndon Johnson did not like to be questioned by Eartha Kitt, and this would be 1968, questioning what's going on. The next day is January the 19th. This is Washington. Here are a bunch of women standing in the snow, and it says, welcome to the Jeannette Rankin Peace Parade. End the war in Vietnam and the social crisis at home. Jeannette Rankin was 87 years old when she organized this rally. She had been a congresswoman from Montana. She first served in the Congress in 1970. She was a pacifist. She voted against United States participation in World War I and in World War II, and that ended her career. She was the only person in Congress to vote against going to war against Japan on December 8, 1941. But she leads 5,000 women on this march, and they're protesting the Vietnam War, and they also send one other message out. Sisterhood is powerful. In other words, we are now in also the Women's Liberation Days. The National Organization of Women at this point, 2 years old, and you're going to hear more from them. So you got the Civil Rights Movement going. You got the Women's Liberation Movement going. And of course, you got the protests against Vietnam. North Korea, we still at war with North Korea, yes or no?
I did.
We are.
Yes.
It's only a truce that was signed in 1953. And occasionally it would flare up. That is Admiral Lloyd Booker. And those are the crewmen of the Pueblo, USS Pueblo, that's seized by North Korea. It's January 23rd. North Korea claimed that the USS Pueblo was spying on them. That's why they seized the boat. The United States would eventually admit that the Pueblo intruded into North Korean territory, but they only did so to get the guys off the boat and back home. Tet Offensive. It is late January 1968. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1967 denounced the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, the protests really begin in earnest in 1967. Well, the Viet Cong attacked South Vietnam, and on January 31st, the Viet Cong soldiers attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The United States won the battle, but they ended up losing the war. They lost the war in terms of public opinion, and you two were protesting back then. The Johnson administration put out this word: the communist forces were weak, and that the U.S.-backed South was winning the war. Well, the United States escalated the war in August of 1964. You're talking 3.5 years later. If the communists are so weak, how come you're still there? By 35%, by February, only 35% of Americans approved Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war. Here's old Iron Pants, Walter Cronkite. Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. Why? Because on November 22nd, 1963, old Iron Pants was told whoever was watching on CBS that the president, John Kennedy, was dead. He composed himself, he shed a tear, took off his glasses, composed himself, got himself together, put the glasses back on, and old Iron Pants was in the saddle, ready to do the news again. I met Walter Cronkite twice, and we never talked about news during my time meeting him. We talked about ice hockey in Houston in the 1930s when he played. Anyway, there is old Iron Pants. Till 1968, network news operations, CBS and NBC specifically, avoided direct criticism of military operations. There was no government censorship, but negative news reports infuriated Johnson, who would call Bill Paley up, the chairman of CBS, in the middle of the night to complain about how could you say this about what's going on in Vietnam. So he didn't hesitate to let networks know what he was thinking. Cronkite's report appeared on CBS on February 27. It was called Report from Vietnam. Who, what, where, when, and why. 5 W's, he left out how. And he makes this conclusion. There he is, Walter Cronkite, who was an old war correspondent during World War II for UP. He said, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy, and they did the best they could." Report from Vietnam allegedly played a major role in turning Americans totally against the war, and the program possibly induced Johnson to abandon his re-election campaign of 1968. How many of you went to bed with Johnny Carson? How many of you went to bed with Johnny Carson?
No.
You never went to bed with Johnny Carson? No? Anybody else go to bed with Johnny Carson? We know you rejected him. Well, Johnny Carson had the #1 late night show back in February of 1968. And he sees what's going on in the country. He notices the Rankin Peace Parade. He knows what's going on with the civil rights movement. And he knows what's going on with young people and the Vietnam War. And he's a comedian. And he feels he is not the person who should be discussing serious issues. So he takes a week off the Tonight Show. And he brings Harry Belafonte in to discuss what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, NBC, in their infinite wisdom, wiped all 5 tapes. It was 5 shows between February 5th and February 9th. They don't exist. Back in those days, generally, in fact, the first Super Bowl, which was the American Football League, National Football League World Championship game in 1967, was a race. They didn't keep too much. And unfortunately, this wasn't kept. Here's Harry Belafonte, here's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Paul Newman is here, and Ed McMahon. Carson says we need a discussion. I'm not the one who should lead that discussion. So it's February 5th through the 9th, and here are some of the guests talking about what's going on in the world with Harry Belafonte. Dionne Warwick, Aretha Franklin, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Both Kennedy and Martin Luther King would be dead within 5 months of this show. Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, Nipsey Russell, Bill Cosby, the indigenous folk singer Buffy St. Marie, who's under fire in Canada right now because people claim she's not an indigenous member of an indigenous tribe or First Nations in Canada. The ventriloquist Aaron Williams and the singer Frida Payne. This is the strike in Memphis, sanitation strike, and it would change American history. How many of you are aware of the Memphis sanitation strike and its role in history? It's important. Here are the striking workers. I am a man, and they are either being protected or they're being watched by army tanks and guys with bayonets. Either watched to make sure they don't cause any problems or being protected from people in the community. On February 1st, the Memphis sanitation workers, Eco Cole and Robert Walker, are crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. On February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, which is not celebrated in the South, but Lincoln's birthday, the Memphis sanitation strike begins. To be a historic work stoppage, the strike lasts until April 16th. That strike would change American history a few weeks from now. The Smothers Brothers. Tommy Smothers just passed away at the age of 86. How many of you watched Smothers Brothers? You watched it? You watched it? Occasionally, back in the day. Well, Smothers Brothers were brought to CBS because CBS felt that their viewership was too old. They had really good shows. Ed Sullivan was still on top, and he was trying to reach younger audiences, but the other shows were Ed Skelton, Lucille Ball, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, which I love because it was so stupid, and Beverly Hillbillies, Mayberry RFD, what was the Andy Griffith Show, brought in older viewers, and they wanted these guys to bring in younger viewers, and they did. And they got 30-year-olds who were recently married, who had disposable income with kids, to attract the advertisers. This show was successful and was profitable, but it became too much for CBS to handle. The other show that was on was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Remember that show? Okay, 2 satirical shows focusing on news taking shots at Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War. Well, Tommy Smothers gets into a battle with CBS. He wants to bring Pete Seeger on the show. Remember Pete Seeger? Pete Seeger, he's been blackballed from TV, blacklisted from TV since the 1950s when it came out that he was a card-carrying communist. Well, CBS said, yeah, okay, we'll let you can have him on, but he cannot sing one song. What song? Waist Deep in the Big Money.
Overcome.
Well, why can't he sing it? Well, we don't want him to. And Tommy Smothers tells Pete Seeger, you sing that song. It's February 25th, and he sings the song. And it's considered symbolic of the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson's policy of escalation, then widely seen as pushing the United States increasingly into an unpopular war. How many of you remember Eugene McCarthy?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. How many, you voted for him?
Ha ha.
You voted for him, that you're giving him the applause? Well, he was just an obscure senator from Minnesota, but he decides to run for president. In the Washington insiders, the people who allegedly know what's going on, they don't. They didn't in 1968, and they don't today. Anyway, 90% of the time they're wrong. They said, nah, this guy has absolutely no chance at all. Yeah, but he catches fire with the Democratic base, and that's all he needs. He was an outspoken critic of the war, and he would start winning primaries because Democrats were sick of the war. He captured 42% of the vote in New Hampshire. He would win 3 primaries over Johnson, then lost 4 of the next 5 to Robert F. Kennedy. And there's Lyndon Johnson, who all of a sudden is in a battle for his presidential life. Robert F. Kennedy joins the presidential hunt on March 16th, 1968. And I got to know Richard Nixon a little bit in the mid-1980s. And so I'll do my impression of Nixon. Anyway, Nixon hears, he wins the Oregon Republican primary, and he hears that Bobby Kennedy is getting in the race. And Nixon says, those Kennedys, something always happens when they're around. And so Nixon realizes that Bobby Kennedy is sort of a threat. But I know too many people who were around during the Bobby Kennedy days. And they told me that basically this was a test run for 1972. He had no organization. He had no money. He had no protection. There were no bodyguards around him. And I'll tell you some of the people who worked for him. Don't laugh when I say the first name. Jerry Springer. Jerry Springer worked for Robert Kennedy. He was a young lawyer at that time. Another guy who worked for him was a guy by the name of Bob Arum, who I got to know during my days covering boxing, sort of. He became a boxing promoter. Another guy was Jeff Greenfeld, who was at ABC and also at CNN. Had a lot of young guys who were very bright, who were not affiliated with anybody. So he gets in the race. The campaign starts on March 16th. It's way late to get money. Way late to get money. And some primaries are already done. Delegates are already handed out. But he's going to give it a go. And he's going to challenge Johnson, who hated him and he hated Johnson. Meanwhile, in London on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, a big demonstration against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. 91 people are injured in the demonstration and 200 are arrested. So here comes 5 of the biggest days in 1968, historical days in 1968. On March 31st, Lyndon Johnson says he is not running for president. He also announced there would be a partial halting of bombing of Vietnam, but he decides, I'm out of here. He's got McCarthy, he's got Kennedy, he decides, that's it, I'm gone. So he tells the country, I'm not running anymore. That's March 31st. April 1st, April 2nd, April 3rd, April 4th. It's my wife. That's the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been there twice, 2004 and 2015. You walk into the place through these doors, you look down at the floor, and it's every march that Martin Luther King participated or led since the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955. Middle-aged African-American, older African-American, a guy who lost his leg in war, average housewife. And you go step by step by step, retracing what Martin Luther King went through in the, 12 and a half years, about 12 and a half years that he was the head of civil rights. Martin Luther King first appears as a civil rights activist in 1946. There's a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, signed by M.L. King, Morehouse College in Atlanta, where he basically says, we want equality. That's where he first surfaces. And that is where he's laid to rest. His wife, Coretta Scott King, is next to that crypt. She was still alive at that point on the campus. At 6:05 Central Time, April the 4th, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was shot dead while standing on a balcony outside his second-floor room at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. News of King's assassination prompted major outbreaks of violence, resulting in more than 40 deaths nationwide, extensive property damage in 100 American cities. Jesse Jackson's here and others said, you notice nobody's really attending to him. He's laying there after he was shot, a picture being taken, and all the guys pointing where the shot rang out from, right there. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King arrived in Tennessee on April the 3rd. His intent was to march on April the 9th on behalf of the Memphis sanitation workers. They have been out on strike for 2 months now, and he is there to lend his support to whatever grievances they have with the city of Memphis. So he gets there on the 3rd, and there he is. This is on April 3rd, and he's giving a speech. Now, if you go through the Martin Luther King Center, there are all kinds of things there, some of his personal stuff, others talking about his home being bombed in Montgomery and being in jail in Birmingham and all. But they also have a clip of some of his most famous speeches. The most famous speech, of course, being the I Have a Dream speech, which was prompted by Mahalia Jackson. Off the top of his head, Mahalia Jackson, August 28, 1963, yells, "Martin, tell him about the dream! Tell him about the dream!" And he told him about the dream. I have a dream. But the most interesting, in my opinion, for me, the most interesting speech he gives is on April 3rd, 1968, to a crowd. And it's a bittersweet speech because he's basically saying goodbye. My time is about up. This is April 3rd. This is what he said. We got some difficult days ahead. He tells an overflowing crowd in Memphis, Tennessee on April 3rd, where the city sanitation workers were striking. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've seen the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. It was like he's telling you goodbye. I'm not going to be here very much longer. And it doesn't matter because I've seen the promised land. Within 24 hours, he's dead. There he is, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson with him, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. As he prepared to leave the Lorraine Motel for dinner at the home of a Memphis minister by the name of Samuel Billy Kyles, King stepped out onto the balcony of room 306 to speak with Southern Christian Leadership Conference colleagues standing in the parking area below. An assassin fired a shot that caused severe wounds right here, jaw, and he was literally dead as soon as he hit the floor. Well, this is the days before we had these things, folks. And the only way you can kind of get instantaneous news is if you carry the transistor radio around. And I don't think in Indianapolis they had an all-news radio station at that point. So Bobby Kennedy is in Indianapolis, and he's campaigning. And you could take a look at all of the faces there, and that'll tell you something. He knows Martin Luther King, they know Martin Luther King is dead, and he is going to make that announcement to his crowd. So this is his speech. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. And with that, Bobby Kennedy put the lid on any kind of violence in Indianapolis. Meanwhile, that guy, James Brown, I feel good. James Brown is the guy in Boston who puts the lid on violence in Boston. he has a concert scheduled, and that's Kevin White. He is the mayor of Boston. And they're going back and forth, should we or shouldn't we have this concert? Should we or shouldn't we? And James Brown said, we're going to have this concert. We're going to have it because I guarantee nothing will happen. And they said, you sure? Absolutely sure. Well, there's a little commotion. And James Brown says, wait a minute. Now wait, step down. Be a gentleman. Now I asked the police to step back because I think I could get some respect from my own people. Brown successfully restored order while keeping the police away from the crowd. Boston had a minimal amount of violence. How many of you recognize Jackie Robinson?
Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson, with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, Martin Luther King said of Jackie Robinson, he made my job easy. Being the first black player in Major League Baseball since 1884. The last one was Moses Fleetwood Walker with the Toledo team of the American Association. He and his brother Weldy, and they were both literally thrown out of baseball in 1884. The National Basketball Association, National Hockey League rescheduled playoff games. Greensboro Open Golf Tournament postponed its final 36 holes. The National Tennis League suspended its matches, as did the North American Soccer League for 4 of its 5 matches, a game in Toronto. Racetracks closed their gates for the day of Martin Luther King's burial. Roberto Clemente said, I'm not playing. Pittsburgh Pirates, I'm not playing. Count me out. Maury Wills, who played with the Los Angeles Dodgers, said, count me out. By the way, the Los Angeles Dodgers traded Maury Wills to Pittsburgh because he was dating Doris Day. And they didn't like the fact that a black guy was dating Doris Day. You know, as white as pure snow, right? And then there's Bill White. I knew Bill White, or I know Bill White, he's still alive. Bill White was the New York Yankees announcer, and we, over the years, talked about Jim Crow in the South when he played with the St. Louis Cardinals, and they trained in St. Petersburg, Florida, and that Gussie Busch, the beer baron, who owned Budweiser, would throw a swank party every year at the Swankies Hotel in St. Petersburg, and he couldn't go, and Bob Gibson couldn't go, Julian Javier couldn't go, because they were black and Jim Crow laws. So Gussie Busch would eventually buy a hotel where he'd throw his big soiree. Bill White said, I was going to play that day, the day of his burial. You know what? He gave his life for people like me. How could I play? How could I play? This was his quote to the Philadelphia Inquirer, who was playing with the Philadelphia Phillies at the time, first base. It angers me that a team which pioneered the advent of the Negro into baseball would take such a stand, playing on the funeral day. Of course, you realize that O'Malley had nothing to do with signing Jackie Robinson. He's a businessman come lately. He's interested in dollars. On the morning of the funeral, April 9th, the Dodgers owner, Walter O'Malley, met with the team's general manager, Buzzy Gervaisi, and shortly thereafter, the team announced that the opener against Philadelphia would be postponed. It's going to be postponed anyway because none of the Philadelphia Phillies baseball players were going to show up. But think of that. Jackie Robinson broke in with the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Dodgers that moved out to Los Angeles. Any old Dodger fans in here? You're an old Dodger fan? And yet, you know, O'Malley, who hated Jackie Robinson, just hated him, decided, let's play. Well, they didn't. That's Washington, D.C. After a few nights of rioting, the National Guard is there. It was claimed that after the King assassination that the United States experienced the greatest wave of social unrest since the Civil War. Some of the biggest riots took place in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, Kansas City. Well, through this all, Lyndon Johnson manages to sign a bill, a Civil Rights Act of 1968, which effectively prohibited housing discrimination based on race. But the Martin Luther King assassination is not the only thing that is troubling the world. Student protests at Columbia University. And to use the old laughing jargon, do the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? Mark Rudd.
I heard that.
You heard that name. I met his mother.
Radishki.
She was, excuse me?
Raditsky.
Yeah, I met his mother. I was giving this talk. I met his mother. She lived in a place like this in New Jersey. And she said to me, he was a nice boy. Came to see me every week, helped me out, helped my husband out. He was a nice boy. Anyway, student protest, Columbia University. You were at Hunter, right? Hunter at the time.
Hunter,
You were also at Hunter at the time
Hunter.
of the demonstrations? Between April 23rd and 30th, student protesters at Columbia University in New York take over the administration buildings and shut down the university. And there is Mark Rudd. But he was such a nice boy. He was a really nice boy. He was good to me and my husband. He was such a nice boy. From 1965 to 1968, I was a student activist and organizer in the Students for a Democratic Society chapter at Columbia University. I was one of the leaders of the spring 1968 occupation of 5 buildings and subsequent strike against the university's complicity with the war and racism. At the time, I was identified by the press as a symbol of student radicals. That means you must have been a student radical if you demonstrated at Hunter, right? How many student radicals are in here? You're a student radical, you're a student radical. See, student radicals. They're all over the place. But would your mother say that you were a nice woman?
No.
No, I don't want to know. Also in France, stop the unconditional bombing of North Vietnam. France got out of Vietnam in 1954 to deal with their colony in Algeria. They wanted to keep that. They decided it was too much of an effort, too much money, too much manpower to stay in Indochina. There were demonstrations and massive general strikes, as well as occupations of university and factories. In Paris, on May 30th, Charles de Gaulle had 1 million of his supporters march up and down Champs-Élysées, calling for the end to the anarchy. Eventually, the President de Gaulle met with the demonstrators, proposed a series of reforms. It ended the protest temporarily. Okay, Robert F. Kennedy. I am tied to Robert F. Kennedy in 2 ways. My friend Shelley Saltman, down the phone, Shelley. Shelley died 6 years ago, but he's always trying to contact me. In fact, one day I mentioned his name in conjunction with this, and I got dinged on my phone, and I said, oh my, he's found me. Anyway, Shelley Saltman was also beaten up by Evel Knievel. You might remember that. He had a client by the name of Andy Williams. And Andy Williams and Bobby Kennedy were like that. They were tight. And Andy calls up Shelley that morning of the California primary. He said, hey, listen, Shelley, I need a favor. Well, what do you need? He said, I need a place to stash Bobby. Can't find him anywhere. He's got to write 2 speeches, one if he wins, one if he loses, and he needs some rest. We got to get him out somewhere. And Shelley says, go to my office. You know, my secretary. I'm not here. I'm going to Denver, so just put him in the office and let him do whatever he needed to do. And that's where Bobby Kennedy wrote his last 2 speeches. So anyway, so Shelley, I know the story, a little of the background story over here. So Bobby Kennedy's in California, wins the primary. There he's giving his winning speech. Shortly after midnight on June 5th, Kennedy is shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after winning the California presidential primary, the Democratic primary. He was shot several times by 24-year-old Palestinian Sirhan Sirhan. He was pronounced dead a day later on June the 6th. About 15 years after this, I got a chance to talk to Rosie Greer. Rosie Greer, who was 6'5", weighed 300 pounds, played football with the New York Giants and the Los Angeles Rams, was one of his 2 bodyguards in California. The other was Rayford Johnson, who won the 1960 Olympic decathlon. No Secret Service protection. And Rosie is promoting a book. He was a knitter, and he was big guy, 6'5", 330 pounds. You wouldn't think would enjoy himself by knitting. Another guy who enjoyed himself knitting was Gene Rayburn, who was the game show host. Anyway, so I have to go talk to him, and under the guise I'm going to talk to him about this book, which I had to, but I didn't. I want to get to this. I said, Rosie, You karate chop Sirhan Sirhan. How'd you do that? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know anything. I just did what I had to do. And then he told me, every day of his life, and he's still alive, every day of his life, he thought about, could I have done more to have protected Bobby Kennedy? Now the first question is why was Sirhan Sirhan in the pantry? I have covered presidential candidates. I interviewed Reagan, I've interviewed Bill Clinton, interviewed Jack Kemp when he was running. And I can tell you one thing, that a political candidate never leaves through an entrance that the public is at. You go through back rooms, you go through pantries, you go through service elevators, part of the protection. So the question is, how did Sirhan Sirhan get in there? Now, there are all these conspiracy theories, he didn't do the shooting. But Rosie Greer's lived with that his entire life. What could I have done to protect Bobby Kennedy? And the answer really is not much. I mean, it was a breakdown of security. Shelley was the one who put together the train trip between St. Patrick's Cathedral and Arlington National Cemetery. Shelley had been friends with Teddy Kennedy and grew up with Teddy in Boston. Well, when they left Bronxville to go to Boston, 1939-40. James Earl Ray is picked up by London officials on June 8th, charged with the murder of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Czechoslovakia had a woman, I was on a cruise ship giving this talk, and this would be back in 2018, 50th anniversary. And she looks at this picture, and she's right in front of me, and she says, oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, there's a tank there and all that. She said, oh, no, no, no. She said, Czechoslovakia, the poets were writing poetry, the musicians were playing in the plaza, and you weren't like this, looking over your shoulder to see who's supporting you. I said, you were there? She said, I was there. I said, okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to interview her. I'm a journalist. I did interview her. I told the people they could eavesdrop, because I had a microphone. And she said, I said, well, what was it like at the end, when the Prague Spring was over? Because Czechoslovakia had been liberated from communism, briefly. She said she's living with her mother, and they're in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. Now Bratislava is part of Slovakia. And she says that they hear airplanes overhead. And her mother said, what are their airplanes doing in Bratislava on August 20th at 11 o'clock? And she goes over, pulls the shade. What are tanks doing in the street in Bratislava on August 20th at 11 o'clock at night? It's over. The Russians invaded, or the Soviets. Prague Spring began on January 5th, when Alexander Dubček was elected first secretary of the Communist Party and continued through August 21st, when the Soviets invaded the country. There were 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops, 5,000 tanks, and they crushed the Prague Spring. A brief period of liberalization in the communist country. The liberal reforms were soon replaced and normalization began. As far as this woman was concerned, she and her mother had visas, and they were going away after the Jewish holidays in October of 1968 to Brussels. And they went to Brussels. They didn't take their visas away. And instead of going to the hotel, they made a U-turn, went to the American embassy, said, we have people in Skokie, Illinois who will sponsor us. They got on the plane, and the two of them never looked back. On the cruise ship, it's really strange. You give talks, and then you're living among people. So the next day, I'm at breakfast, and I see the woman. I said, can I join you for breakfast? She said, yeah. I said, tell me a little bit about your life. Not about that. You were a concentration camp survivor, right? Yeah. She was saved by Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat. It's the first time that I ever met somebody who was saved by Raoul Wallenberg, who gave visas out to get Jews out of Eastern Europe. And I said, the other thing, she and her mother were the only two to survive. I said, has anybody recorded your story? And she said, yeah. Steven Spielberg sent a film crew, gave them 3 hours, told them about my story during the Holocaust. Pol Pot's one of the worst human beings ever in the history of the world. The Khmer Rouge, he headed them up. They formed forces launched an insurgency against Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was a communist party, and North Vietnam helped supply them with shelter and weapons. So I have a friend by the name of Richard Lee. And Richard Lee does talk about how rock songs were the soundtrack of global demonstrations against the Vietnam War. John Lennon wrote a song, which isn't all that good, called Revolution, which actually goes absolutely nowhere. You know, count me out, count me in. But the Beatles do an anti-war song. And that's enough to get other rock musicians to do it, like the Doors and Stephen Stills. But the folkies had been singing out against communism and against the war and against all kinds of things for a while, like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Phil Oakes and Tom Paxton. So the cultural protest merged with the political protest. And of course, in 1969, John Lennon had that song, Give Peace a Chance, which was the soundtrack of a lot of anti-war demonstrations. Please call me Dick. I got to know him because of the baseball umpires dispute in 1984, or 85, which he moderated, or he settled. He was the arbitrator. Richard Nixon gets the Republican nomination. I'm not a crook. Call me Dick. Oh, and so is Pegasus, the pig. He becomes the nominee of the Yippies Party. Political theorists, the Yippies, the Youth International Party, nominated a pig for president on August 23rd in Chicago. Pegasus was arrested with Jerry Rubin and others for disorderly conduct. Well, this was Johnson's guy, Hubert Humphrey. He was his vice president. And Robert Kennedy and Johnson hated one another. So there's always this question about, well, had Kennedy lived, would he have been the Democratic nominee? And the answer is, no, he wouldn't have been. Lyndon Johnson never would have allowed him. So here's Humphrey, who carried out all of Johnson's policies. And here is the Chicago protest. And a woman on the cruise ship, same cruise ship as that woman in Skokie, Illinois, said she was on top of the Conrad Hilton Hotel looking down. Demonstrators and the cops are just itching for a fight. There were protests in the street of Chicago with the Democratic convention in town. Vietnam War is a significant issue. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin vowed to lead Vietnam protesters to Chicago to disrupt the convention, and Mayor Richard Daley is not happy about that. It was Daley during the rioting after Martin Luther King was assassinated that told his cops, shoot to kill under certain circumstances to quell the rioting. He's afraid that Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman are going to get this big truck loaded with LSD and throw it into the Lake Michigan Reservoir, and everybody in Chicago will be high as a kite. Now, I was watching Batman. I still watch Batman. It's on Heroes and something else network. It's on every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock and Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. And believe it or not, there was an official from Gotham City who was worried that the Joker was going to dump hallucinogenics into the Gotham City water supply. And I thought, is that where Richard Daley got the idea that Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were going to make everybody as high as a kite on LSD? Anyway, there he is, Mayor Daley. Dick Daley, the mayor, made it clear he would block any of the protesters' attempts to disrupt the convention or sully the city's name. He did everything he could to curtail the voices of those who were speaking out against the war. This is Rennie Davis, and he is yelling at guys like that. I did this talk on Saturday. There was a guy who was there who said, I was leaning on a lamppost like that. I fell over, split my head open. He said, but the cops are okay to me. They bandaged me up. I said, was it worth it? He said, 56 years later, it was stupid on my part. Really stupid. 28th of August, TV cameramen in the Conrad Hilton Hotel turned their cameras down on the crowd. The crowd's chanting, the world is watching. Thousands of protesters streamed out of Grant Park into a sea of tear gas and billy clubs. Some were caught in a crush against the facade of the Hilton Hotel, fell through the plate glass window. cutting themselves on shards. People on the upper floors threw crystal ashtrays out the window, one of which struck a bypasser, shattered, embedding glass in his eyes. Blood ran from skulls into the gutters. Someone tried to overturn the police van. And there you go. There's the whole world is watching. An official report found that the police acted out of proportion to the provocations and largely targeted people that did nothing to provoke the officers. It was, the report concluded, a police riot driven partially by Richard Daley, who had given police license to shoot to kill under some circumstances. And that is the Chicago 7. That guy said, yeah, I knew all of them. So you want to talk about them? He said, yeah, Tom Hayden ended up marrying Jane Fonda. I said, yeah, that's true. John Froys, Tom Hayden, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, no relation, Abby Hoffman, Rennie Davis, David Dillinger. They were the Chicago 7. There were actually 8 that were arrested with conspiracy and inciting to riot. Bobby Seale was so bad in the courtroom, he was carried out and he was tried separately. Abraham Ribicoff was the Connecticut senator, and he's making a nominating speech, and he changes the subject. He says, the Chicago police, they're using Gestapo tactics. And that's Abraham Ribicoff, Richard Daley, giving the cutthroat side, saying, Abraham Ribicoff, get off the stage. We don't want to hear you. The Chicago Tribune, hardly a liberal newspaper, conservative newspaper. Many convention visitors were appalled at what they considered unnatural enthusiasm of the police for arresting demonstrators. Hello. Any of you a radical woman? Any of you burn your bras in 1968? You're smiling. You heard about burning your bras, right? Right? That was a big, big thing. A big slogan, burn your bra, and it got the attention of people. These are the New York radical women, and they're led by Robin Morgan, who was a former child star, and she invited women of every political persuasion to the Atlantic City Boardwalk on September 7th, the day of the Miss America contest. They would protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us. The protest would feature a freedom trash can, because if you tried to burn your bra, it was illegal, because the boardwalk's made of wood, and the wood may catch fire from a burning bra. So women can throw away all of the manifestations of women's oppression: bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, representative issues of Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and Family Circle. And I'll tell you how important the media thought this was. They sent a woman out to cover the story. Now, when I say that, I don't mean it disparagingly today, but women were at the lowest end of the totem pole in radio and TV and newspapers in 1968, and if a woman got an assignment, it meant the assignment really wasn't all that important. Although Dixie Chappelle was a photojournalist and was the first person ever killed in Vietnam. She was a woman. She was also covered the Hungarian Revolt in 1956. So there were women who were doing things, but for the most part, they were marginalized. 1968 protests didn't change the Miss America pageant, but it did introduce feminism into the mainstream consciousness and expand the national conversation about the rights and liberation of women. All because of that question: did you burn your bra? It got people interested. That's all you had to do. Sock it to me? That man in the middle, why is he smiling? He has no sense of humor at all. But he makes history. He changes campaigns again, like he did in 1960, when he debated Kennedy and looked like he walked off the IRT on July 23rd, when there was no air conditioning and it was 105 degrees and humidity's 100%, and he's packed in like a sardine. He looks terrible, his suit is wrinkly, he's got a 5 o'clock shadow, his makeup is running, he's sweating, and Kennedy looked cool, calm, and collective. Does he look presidential? Second time he changed it, he goes on a comedy show. The presidential candidate, Richard Nixon, was on Laugh-In on September 16th. It took 6 takes for Nixon to say 4 words. "Sock it to me?" without sounding angry or offended. He went on the show. Why would he be angry or offended? Laugh-In was aimed at a politically aware and socially conscious audience and featured rapid-fire one-liners. Well, the Smothers Brothers are in trouble again, and Harry Belafonte is part of it. Harry Belafonte, who was given the chair on The Tonight Show. Smothers Brothers submit their shows on tape 10 days in advance of air dates, so the censors could go through them. In the 1968-69 season premiere, CBS deleted an entire segment of Harry Belafonte singing "Lord, Don't Stop the Carnival" against the backdrop of the riots at the '68 Chicago Democratic Convention. And they also deleted 2 lines of satire from their main competitor, Bonanza. What? Hostile, "Hey, Pa, Hop Sing didn't make my soup good?" Why? Anyway, so instead of seeing Harry Belafonte, you saw 5 minutes of Richard Nixon commercials. Now you tell me, who's watching the Smothers Brothers who's voting for Richard Nixon? No one. 0. So, but Bill Paley thought it was cute, the CBS founder in 1927. So, 5 minutes worth of Richard Nixon ads. Pat Paulson is running for president. He was cast as their editorialist in his deadpan, double-talk comments on the issues of the day. He would be the first TV comedian to run for president. In January, the Smothers Brothers head writer Mason Williams conceived a mock presidential campaign. Like all campaigns back then, Paulson's began with a denial. True, all the present candidates once denied they had any intentions of running, but the fact that I'm also a liar doesn't make me a candidate. Mexico City, 3 weeks before the Olympics, there's protests. Students from colleges and high schools, 70 universities, high schools. They are coordinating a protest to promote social, educational, and political reforms. On October 2nd, 10,000 university and high school students gather in the Cultural Plaza in Mexico City to protest government actions and listen to speeches. At 5:55, 2 flares are shot. At 6:15, more red flares are shot, this time from a helicopter. 5,000 soldiers, 200 tanks and trucks surround the plaza. Many died, many are arrested. The excuse? We're there to help you, demonstrators. We're here to be your friends. The official account of the events would be that the students were infiltrated by communist forces. And they had fired on the army, and the soldiers had to fire back to defend themselves. And they're there to help the demonstrators. They're still sticking to that story. Then there's Jose Feliciano. He's a foreigner from Puerto Rico. Well, he really isn't. He's an American citizen. Prior to Game 5 on October 7th of the St. Louis-Detroit World Series matchup, Jose Feliciano sang the lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner to a new tune with a Latin twist. The audience responded immediately with both cheers and boos. Irate callers to NBC carrying the game. Entire stadium thought Feliciano's version of the national anthem was unpatriotic. And besides, he's a foreigner from Puerto Rico, American citizen. And then there's the Mexico City Olympics, and that's John Carlos, and that's on the right, Tommy Smith in the middle, and Peter Norman, Austria. Dr. Tommy Smith originally advocated an Olympics boycott. His demands were South Africa and Rhodesia be uninvited from the Olympics because of South Africa's apartheid and Rhodesia supporting them. The restoration of Muhammad Ali's heavyweight boxing titles, that the racist and anti-Semite Avery Brundage stepped down as president of the International Olympic Committee, and more African Americans should become assistant coaches. Protests have been planned between the 2 athletes after the Smith and Carlos walked to the podium, took off their shoes to protest poverty. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynchings. And when the national anthem was played, they lowered their heads in defiance and raised their fists in a Black Power salute that rocked the world. There they are on the podium. And there is Peter Norman from Australia. I don't like the idea of people looking at it as a negative, Tommy Smith said years later. It's nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head, acknowledgement of the American flag, not symbolizing hatred for it. Dr. Smith taught sociology at Oberlin College. One of his students was my wife's cousin, who lives in Scarsdale. He was also on the track and field team, and he and Tommy Smith are friends to this day. He also played football for the American Football League Cincinnati Bengals in 1969. Carlos worked as a guidance counselor at Palm Springs High School in California, told the Guardian newspaper, "I had a moral obligation to step up. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations they had." Well, Smith wins. Norman second. On his left breast, the Australian wore a small badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, an organization set up in 1967 to oppose racism in sport. Norman suggested that Carlos and Smith split their gloves. He asked a member of the rowing team, the U.S. rowing team, for a badge to wear. With that, he became literally a non-citizen of Australia for the rest of his life. Well, Nixon wins. Winning is more fun. Humphrey concedes. Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, did not break with the president in the course of the Vietnam War. He lost by 510,000 votes. One of the tightest presidential races ever. Segregationist candidate George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, won Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Hair, how many of you saw Hair? Nobody? It was on Broadway, opened April 29th, ran for 1,700 performances, and introduced mainstream theater goers to sex, drugs, rock and roll, and draft resistance. How many Elvis fans are here? Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Elvis. Did you find Elvis obscene?
No.
No. No.
He was joined.
Well, there were a lot of people who found him obscene for whatever reason, and all he was doing was this. Thank you very much.
J.T. Baker.
December 3rd, Singer Sewing Machine. Singer presents Elvis, or the Elvis Comeback, aired on NBC in the United States. Initially planned as a Christmas special by the network, and the manager of Elvis Presley, the Colonel Tom Parker, he wasn't a colonel. The producer Bob Finkel hired director Steve Binder to update Presley's sound, create a concert that would appeal to a younger audience. Filming took place in beautiful downtown Burbank at the NBC studios. In June, the show consisted of a sit-down section, stand-up numbers, 2 musicals. The sit-down session showcased Elvis in an informal setting surrounded by fans and a small band. He liked it so much he was there for hours. It was the top-rated show of 1968-69. And we leave Earth, and we leave 1968 with these 3 guys. Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell. Apollo 8's mission was changed in August to a more ambitious command module-only lunar orbit to be flown in December, as the lunar module was not ready to make a flight. He's got the whole world in his hands. First time you ever saw the whole Earth, right? First time. Circling the moon on Christmas Eve, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders read passages from the Bible, Genesis. The Earth is good. Don't mess with it. My friend Dick Hull, who's about 90 years old now, worked for NASA at that time. And he told me they got more fan letters from the Apollo 8 mission than the Apollo 11 mission when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. Well, what's the legacy? The problems, of course, don't end on December 31st. 68 would shape generations to come. Nixon did become president. James Earl Ray was convicted of killing the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in 1969. Civil rights movement was headed in different directions in 1968 and would so in 69. That's Tate Reeves, the governor of Mississippi. In April 2023, the Tennessee House expelled 2 black lawmakers. One of the members represented Memphis. Why was he expelled? Protesting gun violence. A leaked recording of Republicans talking was filled with racial overtones. The lawmakers were reinstated. Southern states such as Mississippi celebrate Confederacy months and explain that the Civil War was not about slavery, but states' rights. The Vietnam War ended in 1973. Man landed on the moon, July 1969. The Smothers Brothers fired by CBS in 1969. Oh, I'm not a crook. Nixon. Sirhan, convicted of killing Robert Kennedy. Nixon would resign as president August 9th, 1974. Czechoslovakia is now separate countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. In February 1970, 5 of the Chicago 7 convicted of intent to incite riot while crossing state lines. Their conviction was released, or their convictions were released on appeal. Robin Morgan continued protesting. Jerry Rubin went into a Wall Street business. Tom Hayden, Mary Jane Fonda became a politician. Mark Rudd was jailed and became a math teacher and speaker. Rennie Davis became a venture capitalist, from an anti-war protester to a venture capitalist. Abbie Hoffman, after being jailed on a drug charge, became an environmental activist. He committed suicide in 1989. That's Cambodia, and that is the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. During the Khmer Rouge reign, from 75 to 79, somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 million Cambodians died from execution, starvation, or disease, about a quarter of the population. The present Cambodian government does not require educators teach children about the Khmer Rouge atrocities. Soviet Union dissolves in 1991. Charles de Gaulle's reform package in France defeated in 1969. He retired. Here's Johnny. Johnny retired from hosting the Tonight Show, Johnny Carson, in 1992 after a 30-year run. That is the Pueblo today. It's a museum. According to the U.S. Navy, it's an active ship. It's being held in North Korea. It's been turned into a piece of propaganda. It's being exhibited as the Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum ship. Peter Norman became an invisible Australian citizen. He was not allowed to compete in 1972 Olympics, even though he made the team. It would not be until 2012, 6 years after his death, that the Australian Parliament apologized to him for the way the country treated him. Thank you very much. Elvis became a novelty act in Las Vegas. And anti-war and protest songs continued through the early 1970s, but faded when the disco era took hold. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn to talk.